such a tragic event happening on the New York City subway. Lots of discourse around this. Jordan Neely, he was a Michael Jackson impersonator at one time. There was an altercation on the subway. Now, we don't know a lot of the details. There's conflicting things that are coming from the witnesses. What we do know is this. Mr. Neely was very terribly mentally disturbed. He was a mentally ill person who was on the New York City subway, who at some point lost his composure while he was there, either asking for money or violently threatening passengers. That's what some people are saying. Other people are saying he didn't violently threaten. Eventually, he was restrained by a man named Daniel Penny, who was on the New York City subway. Penny maintains that he was protecting himself and others whenever he put Miss Neely into a chokehold. Eventually, he was held, Neely, not only by Daniel Penny, but by two other bystanders who were there as Neely was trying to free himself. After 15 minutes of being held there, and they were trying to alert police officers, he eventually died as a result, probably from restriction of his airway. So anyway, lots of discourse around self-defense. Should these mentally ill people even be there? How exactly should we deal with this in the future? And the overwhelming consensus, I think, Ryan, from a lot of outside of the self-defense is like, okay, I think we can all agree it is menacing to have like mentally ill vagrants like all over cities. Then the question comes, because it's dangerous. There's a woman here in Washington, D.C., I forget her name, who was stabbed to death randomly. This is has become fairly noticeable basically across all urban areas. I've traveled basically all across the country in the last couple of years, and I've noticed I will still never forget personally Skid Row. Skid Row is probably the worst thing I have ever seen. I have seen people missing limbs in Cambodia, street slums in Bombay, and I'm telling you, I really think Skid Row might be one of the saddest things I've ever seen, like a genuine human tragedy. But Skid Row, Los Angeles, San Francisco, of course, is famous, but they're not the only ones. You know, go on down by the lake. In Austin, there were homeless encampments, at least there for a time. Here in Washington, I'm sure you and I have noticed this. I've noticed it basically everywhere. So this is becoming a metropolitan problem generally for America. Whenever it comes to the question of mental health, the idea comes of we need more mental health resources. And the presumption for Mr. Neely was that there were no mental health resources. But here is the crazy part, and this is why I think it's a discourse breaker. He was well known to New York City homeless advocate authorities. Put this up there on the screen. Not only had he been arrested over 40 times and released, but outreach workers in New York City said he was on the top 50 list, which is a roster maintained by the city of homeless people who were living on the streets, whom officials consider most urgently in the need of assistance and of treatment. And the reason why I think this is a discourse breaker is that not only was he on the top 50, I guess, worst, homeless people list or whatever for New York City, he was taken to hospitals numerous times, both voluntarily and involuntarily. So then the question comes to this. You have a person who's been arrested 40 times or so, well known to police. Now, we can agree, it's inhumane to throw mentally ill people in prison where they're obviously not going to be rehabilitated. So then it comes to the question of, well, how do mental health authorities rehabilitate or even, frankly, just deal with people who are this mentally ill? But we have to balance that with civil liberties. The fact is, Neely is an American citizen. I've talked a lot here about part of my objection to some red flag laws is, basically it's like a quasi-depriving you of your constitutional right through a legalistic process where you haven't actually done anything. You haven't actually committed a crime yet. And even when you do commit crimes, like we have, sentences laid out and all of that for a reason. So I don't really know what to make of this, Ryan. It is clear here that he had mental health resources. Everyone's like, oh, we need mental health. Look, if you're on a list and you've been arrested more than 40 times, the city knows who you are. But they even involuntarily had committed him. And then it's a question of should we have lifetime involuntary commitment? That's a system we moved away from in the 1980s. Specifically to balance civil liberty concerns, but also funding. And there's a lot of questions about that. So I don't know what to make of this. I'm curious what you...
Right, and then the question is, what does the commitment look like? Because the Times writes about how Neely, most of his arrests were the nuisance things that are associated with homelessness.
Yes.
Urinating in public, jumping the turnstile.
Right. Which we've all seen if you've ever been in New York
City.
But
But then there was one, maybe a year or two ago or so, where he punched a woman in the face, broke her nose, caused a lot of damage to her, was arrested, charged with a felony for this. And they worked out a plea deal where he would agree to commit himself, basically, take his medication, enter into this particular program, trying to get his life back on track. The judges, he and the judge and the prosecutor and defense attorney, everybody works this out. And he only lasted a few days. Wow. And he kind of slips out. So then the question is, what do you have to do when it comes to security at these mental health institutions? Because if you are, and then are you in prison? Because like a hospital setting is not a prison. Yeah. Yet he's committed to go to this setting. He needs it. He understands in his kind of lucid moments that he needs it. And it is preferable to the alternative, which is the conviction for the felony and getting sent away to prison. That doesn't help anybody. But then he just walks out. And then police encountered him multiple times. After the Times article is really worth reading.
I recommend people read this. This is, again, we are not trying to get into like, oh, should you defend people should you even be in this situation? We're like, hey, everyone agrees we should have more resources. How do we balance resources with civil liberty concerns? I have no answer. I actually don't have an answer. I don't know what it is. I could only look at this and just be like, wow, what a tragedy, man.
There were multiple failures where officers were called because he was at one time, he's peeing at the Coney Island end of the subway. Another time he was doing something else that brought cops out. And none of those times were they able to link the fact that he had this warrant out.
Right. Well, because he doesn't have ID. Yeah, so then it's,
But they also know who he is, at this point.
Right.
But it is interesting when you think about this top 50 list, because as we know that in every universe, a very small number of people are responsible for a huge amount of things,
That's
whether
actually
it's
a case
like
of
comments on a YouTube page or whether, exactly.
Yeah, it reminded me of shoplifters in New York. I got to find this. Yes. A tiny number of shoplifters commit thousands of New York City thefts. So nearly 1/3 of all shoplifting arrests in the city last year involved just 327 people. That, I think, genuinely is a question of just lock them up, because I don't think that those people are, maybe they are mentally, I don't know, maybe they have some like shoplifting disease, but that possibly could come to prosecutorial discretion. I'm curious what you think. I know you're a criminal justice reform advocate. How do you deal with something like this?
So there was a rise in this idea of swift and certain punishment, along with the criminal justice reform movement, that I think is still getting implemented in some places, but it lost a little favor in the kind of face of the rise of kind of abolition and which runs counter to it. But what swift and certain means is that too often people who are in the criminal justice system don't have any certainty about what their punishment is going to be, and they wait forever to find out what it's going to be. And so if you get caught shoplifting, you may get no penalty at all. It might take 5 years for them to run you through the system. Or you might wind up getting some weird judge who gives you 3 years if you're over like a felonious level of theft.
Right.
And they say what that does to people is that they just take their chances.
Yes.
Because the gamble at that point is to not worry about the consequences. What swift and certain means is that if you commit the crime or you violate probation or parole, the punishment is going to be like immediate, like you're doing a weekend.
Yeah, you're going.
And it's always going to happen. You don't have there's no question about it. And so as you're thinking through your decision matrix, that is in your mind. But it also then is much shorter. Like the idea is you're only going to do a weekend.
Oh, I see.
And the idea is that people don't want to go to prison, period.
Yes.
Now, some people who are so far gone, like Neely, who are like in the throes of a mental health crisis, I don't care if they send me to Rikers. I don't care. I'm so miserable. I'm so out of it at this point. I think we deinstitutionalized our mental health response over the last 20 years. And I think the pendulum swung so far that now there is really a gap. Like if you have ever tried to get somebody into treatment, what you'll find calling around is there just aren't beds.
Yeah, this is the one where I have no, again, I don't know how to solve it, because you're pointing out a very important point about beds and hospital capacity. Because we have an insane healthcare system, mental health beds are very limited. You want to know why? There's no profit. There ain't no profit in mental health. So we have,
they're uninsured people for the most part.
we got tons of ICUs because we can print money off people with ICU who are in the or in like critical health or kidney disease, whatever, heart disease, any of that. Those are very, very profitable industries. But there's basically no money, recurring revenue, especially in mentally ill. So when the deinstitutionalization movement happened, we basically kicked it to a private, quasi-public private healthcare system, which increased funding cuts. Obamacare has a role in this as well. Even though people have coverage, the vast majority of people who need them don't have coverage. And then it comes a question of like Medicaid reimbursement, which the rate is very low. So a lot of doctors don't want to be involved. So it gets kicked to this basically catch and release type program for a lot of mentally ill homeless people. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think about the institutionalization movement, and on the one hand, obviously it had some benefits, like, you know, people like Neely and all of those would be institutionalized, it would be cared for by the state. Basically the public menace would be balanced with him hopefully getting the best care possible in someone like with that condition. On the other hand, how many stories you read from the 1920s and 1930s of they're like, this woman wants a job. We got to institutionalize her. And you're like, wait, what? Like, what's happening here? You know? So like, she's got newfangled ideas about voting. These are real stories. I'm not joking about the way that the institutionalization was actually weaponized as a tool of political repression. So that actually, I'm trying to think. It's like Sherman, we were just talking about the Civil War. William Tecumseh Sherman, they're like, he's lost his mind because they thought that they're like, he's gone mad because he was like, no, this war is not going to be swift. It'll actually be very long and terrible. He literally thought he had lost his mind as a result of that.
He's like, I will make sure it's terrible.
Yes, exactly. So the point is that I don't know. You know, I don't know how you balance those two things. I'm thinking though, looking at this, is probably got to get back to some level of institutionalization. I mean, I'm really at a point now where I've taken the Schellenberger pill for people who, and I know you don't like Michael Schellenberger, but I do. I read his book.
Interesting guy.
I think San Francisco is the best possible policy solution yet that I have seen around this entire thing, which is we should acknowledge a couple of things. We have a mental health crisis. We have a mental health crisis which is compounded by drug use, specifically fentanyl, which is leading to mass death amongst a lot of people. The answer, in my opinion, is that overcriminalization clearly is not working. It's just not the answer. Also, though, it is deeply inhumane to let people just get shoot up on the streets and who are raping and killing each other, as I referenced in Skid Row. The answer has to be some level of effectively involuntary commitment where we're like, look, we're not going to lock you up, but you are going to rehab and you're going there for a long time. And it's basically the Portugal model of drugs are not legal, but try shooting up in a park in Lisbon. It's not going to happen. The cops are going to be like, all right, you're going to prison or you're going to rehab. You have no choice. And we have to, the way I've heard it described is you need paternalistic libertarianism here, where it's like you are free to do what you want within the bounds of not being a public menace. But once you cross that threshold, there are swift and clear consequences, as you were saying.
Because you also have to realize that the people who are in those crisis situations are not. They're not happy. They're not living meaningful.
Oh God, no.
Lives. It's
watch
like
the soft white underbelly channel.
It's dangerous.
Right.
To them, it's dangerous to others.
Very.
And so, I do think Portugal. I think Portugal is a really interesting model, you know, to think about. That if you've gotten to a place where you're regularly, basically, out in public, you probably have gone too far.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And are not in a place that is making you contented either.
No, yeah. I mean that was really the saddest part. I recommend, I just referenced it, the Soft White Underbelly channel. Mark Lyda has done a fantastic job of. I watched that and I was like, yeah, this is not really like. I'm like, to the extent this is a mental health problem, I'm like, these people are just drug addicts. Like, and I'm not saying that in a derogatory way. I'm like, these people are hardcore drug addicts, to which the more fascinating thing, actually, was listening to interviews of people who are diagnosed mentally ill and who talk about how the drugs make it 10 times worse. I listened to a guy who had schizophrenia, and he's like, yeah, whenever I'm not on drugs and I have schizophrenia, it's like more the hallucinations and the vivid like ideas in your head are not as dangerous. Where he's like, when you pair it with speed, he's like, it literally made me commit murder. Or not murder, like an assault. And I was like, wow, like, the compounding nature of these two things is actually probably what produces the most dangerous people, in society. So,
and people in those situations will say it's not as if I can decide tomorrow.
Yeah, that's right.
That let's say you could kick your habit and determine that you are going to turn yourself around, you're going to get a job, you get housing. It's not, you can't get a job because of the record that you've racked up over the years. And housing, people who with jobs are having a hard time getting housing. So unless we create an actual pathway for people out of that situation that is credible to them, and because right now there isn't one, like you can't lie to them and claim that there's some way to turn this around, then to them the rational thing is just to stay in this cul-de-sac of misery.
Look, I mean, many of them, like you said, unfortunately, are making the rational choice. If you do want to support your drug addiction, it's just, turn downtown Los Angeles not only into a hellhole, and I don't mean it, again, in terms of like, just get rid of all of them. I'm like, watching this, I don't know. That one really scarred me. I'll tell you, I've seen some bad stuff, and that is still one of the worst things I've ever seen.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Saagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.